All right, good. Whoa, a little loud, Jared. A little loud. I'm naturally loud, and that just makes it start echoing like our guest speaker a couple of Wednesday nights ago was echoing in here. At least it was to me. Well, good morning, everyone. David asked me to talk this morning. As we're kind of switching out through the summer. With our auditorium class, so y'all are stuck with me for this week and next. So if you don't like this week, sorry, you get me next week too. But the topic that is chosen this morning is royal priest. The royal priest and the royal priesthood. So if I was to ask you the question, what is the role of a priest, what would you say? I heard somebody over here. Intermediary, okay. They would intermediate between the nation of Israel and God. What else? Sure, they were supposed to be the ones that would lead the people. Anything else? Sure, they were the ones that offered sacrifices. They were supposed to be a mouthpiece. See, in the Bible, the role of a priest is quite clear. They were to represent God to the people, and they were supposed to represent the people back to God. Have you ever thought about it in that simple definition? The priest supposed to be that mouthpiece, represent God to the people, but then they're the ones that went on, as Brent mentioned, they were the ones that went before God for the people. And we see that type of calling in the opening pages of the Bible all the way till we see it at the very end, don't we? We see it from the very beginning, and then it culminates with the true royal priest, and that being Jesus Christ. And then as Peter calls us, we are to be those living stones, a royal priesthood. And so that's kind of gives you an idea of where we're going to go with this week and next week. This week I want us to focus mainly on Old Testament, and then next week we'll start applying it to New Testament. So I think in order for us to understand this very important biblical theme of a priest or priesthood, we have to first look at what it means to be that priest, according to the Bible. As we mentioned just a second ago, a priest is someone who kind of bridges that gap in between earth and heaven, so to speak. That overlapping boundary of heaven and earth, their primary function is to represent God to the people. And then again, the people back to God. They acted as the mediators between heaven and earth, between the divine and the human. And they were also kind of embodied the representatives of the divine. As we later see with the tribe of Levite, they were set apart to be the priestly tribe. And they were the ones that were often looked to as the examples of, how they were to live and how they were to obey God's commandments. Does anyone know the first person that was named priest, officially named priest, in the Bible? Quick little trivia question. Nope. Before Aaron. Nope. It's one that we don't know very much of, but is Melchizedek. He was the first priest ever named. Yeah, like Methuselah. We're on the same page, don't worry. Yep, Melchizedek in Genesis chapter 14 is the first time that we hear somebody called priest. And we'll talk about him a little bit here in a minute. But after we meet Melchizedek, there's a few other priests before we get to Aaron. In Genesis chapter 41, verse 45, Joseph in Egypt marries the daughter of a priest in Egypt. Exodus 2, chapter 2, verse 16, Jethro, the father-in-law of Moses, is the priest of Midian. And we know Midian's a tribal inhabiting the tribal group inhabiting the deserts southeast of Canaan. And then Exodus 31, verse 10, we know Aaron is appointed as the high priest of Israel. But let's go back to what I said earlier on a priest was kind of embody, God in that human form, so to speak. They were the ones supposed to kind of represent God and be able to teach the nation of who God was. The priest is kind of that biblical category used to describe someone whose job is to represent and embody God's heavenly divine presence on earth, specifically in the sacred places and the sacred roles. We see that later on as the tabernacle and the temple are introduced with, the priest would maintain and work the tabernacle, and then the high priest once a year would go into the Holy of Holies, the holiest place. The high priest would, put on his garb that linen ephod that was designed specifically for that day. Remember, it had the breastplate with the different tribes on it, and he would go before God to represent the nation. But priests were not the only ones that did that. There are actually three kind of overlapping roles for us to think about in the Bible where people represent God. There's the priests. Thinking of the Old Testament, what were the other two? Three total. Who else represented God? Prophets. One more. No wrong answer unless you say Methuselah. What about the kings? Remember whenever the nation, they looked around whenever they were trying to decide who they were, and they said, well, wait a second, all the other nations have kings. We want a king. And God reluctantly said, okay. That wasn't how I designed it, but basically I'm kind of tired of listening to you complain. Here you go. Here's you some kings. The prophets, as we mentioned, they represented God's power and his purpose to people on earth. They were the ones that oftentimes spoke, or they specifically lived out an example of how God loved or felt about the nation of Israel. One that I think of that Danielle and I have been studying over the last week in our kind of nightly devotionals, Hosea. You think of that story of Hosea, and God tells him to go marry Gomer. And then, as we know, Gomer, they have kids, but Gomer is not faithful to the marriage. And Gomer goes on and cheats on her husband, and then disappears for 3 years, and ultimately is found at a slave auction. And God tells Hosea to go purchase her back, to redeem her. And he redeems her because he loved her. And we see, how that life example of Hosea as a prophet correlates to God's relationship with the nation of Israel. The kings, they represented God's presence and his powerful role on earth. In the context of a group's social, the political life, they kind of represented God from that standpoint. But you see, the priests, the prophets, the kings, they're all later biblical categories that only partially represent something that is core to each category. No, apart, they represent something that is actually common. The concept of God's presence, the concept of God's word, and the concept of God's power embodied in human forms. The power being kings, the word being prophets, presence being the priests. See, all those kind of culminate And if I was thinking about it, I would have put up a slide, but I didn't have time to kind of create it. But if you think of those diagrams where you have circles that kind of overlap, and in the middle here's this, here's this, here's this. If you think of having three circles that have a prophet, a priest, a king, they all kind of culminate in one center part, and we see that is, that's the image of God. That is Christ. We know later on that he's labeled a prophet, a priest, a king. But the priesthood is only one part of that triad, of those three. And it's focused specifically on the role of representing God in a sacred place. But I think the core idea is more fundamental. So this morning I want us to dive a little bit more into that as well. The story of the Bible is about how humanity was created in God's image and made to rule and represent the divine presence, his power, his purpose on earth. And it is only after the introduction of human rebellion and human sin that those roles break apart from each other. They're separated. And again, the story of Jesus is about how those three separate roles come back in as one and reunited as the person of Jesus the Christ. Because again, he's depicted as a prophet, a priest, and king. So let's look at the humanity of God's royal image. As we talk about a royal priest, it's hard to not start at the beginning with God's royal image. Think of the framework of the 6 days of creation. The first day, let there be light, separates light and darkness. Then we know it's the land and the sea, and then the fish and the birds and the trees. And we have all this during creation. And what does it culminate with? What's the apex of creation? Day 6, man. Man's created on day 6. God's image is clearly the climactic act of his handiwork, of his workmanship. That's why I think he saved it for last. Because man was his climax, the apex of his creation. I think I put this slide up there on the verses. Yes. Genesis chapter 1, verse 26 through 28 reads, "Then God said, let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish in the sea, and over the birds of the heavens, and over the livestock, and over the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth." Verse 27, "So God created man in his own image, and in the image of God he created him, male and female he created them. And God blessed them, and God said to them, be fruitful and multiply, and fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the heavens, and over every living thing that moves on the earth." Genesis 1, 26 through 28. I want us to notice something in these verses. Notice the use of the term rule in this passage. It says that they are going to have dominion over them. They are going to rule over everything else. If you go back to the Hebrew, to the original, what the English Standard translates as dominion, have the dominion, it is the Greek word that we translate as to rule. So when it says, and let them have dominion, and let them, in other words, let them rule over, in order that they may rule, instead of that they may have dominion, the purpose of humanity's appointment as the divine image is to rule over creation. In Genesis chapter 1, it is clear that God alone has the unique mastery of and power over whatever was chaotic nothingness to create the world that we know now. He alone can speak reality into an ordered existence, and then he turns it over to man. Now humanity is appointed as God's delegate ruler over the fish, over the birds, over the animals, over the things that creep. No, as humans, we are as embodied physical images of the divine ruler. Also want us to note that in verse 27 where it says that God created man in his own image, and in the image of God he created him, the Hebrew word for image there is, I'll spell it because I don't know how to say it, T-S-E-L-E-M, so tselem, something like that. I didn't take Hebrew, I didn't take Greek. Nonetheless, that Hebrew word and the likeness, where it says that we're created in the likeness of God, that Hebrew word demut are most commonly used to refer to physical statues. Physical statues of stone or wood, and these are often usually translated as idol or statue. If you look at Numbers chapter 33, verse 51 and 52, it says, "Speak to the people of Israel and say to them, when you pass over the Jordan into the land of Canaan, then you shall drive out all the inhabitants of the land and before you and destroy all their figured stones." It's the same Hebrew word that God used back as image, back in Genesis chapter 1. And destroy all of their metal images and demolish all of their high places. See, when God is commanding the nation to go and to conquer, he's saying drive all of their gods out, all of their images. It's the same Hebrew word back to Genesis chapter 1. Oh. And then in 2 Kings verse 11 and 18, we see it again. It says, "Then all the people of the land went to the house of Baal and tore it down. His altars and his images they broke in pieces, and they killed Mattan, the priest of Baal, before the altars, and the priests posted watchmen over the house of the Lord." You see, the same Hebrew words that God uses to describe man is what was later used to describe idols and those carved images that we see. So I think just looking at just the Hebrew words and the context that it's written in, we can see where we can kind of conclude that it's, God is thinking of us originally till we fall apart. But he looks as man as kind of a reincarnation of his image, of his true self, of his divine presence. And we know that in the garden, we'll look at the garden, but we look at the Garden of Eden and we see where Adam and Eve, after creation, they walk with God, they talk with God. It wasn't until they're deceived and they mess up that union is severed. I don't know if you can read this or not. A few other Hebrew words. When it talked about the garden, I don't have that verse up there, but whenever God created man, they were to do a few things. They were to serve and to keep the garden, weren't they? The Hebrew word shamar, meaning to serve and keep, is used in the Bible, and it referenced a priestly service of worship. Other words of abad, it means to work, to serve, to worship. It's another Hebrew word that is used to describe what Adam and Eve were to do in the garden. If you look at that first one, abad, which means in the verb tense of to work, we see it in Exodus chapter 20, verse 8 and 10. "Remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all of your abad, to do all your work. But on the seventh day, it is the Sabbath, to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any abod. You should not do any work. Neither you, nor your son, nor your daughter, nor your male, nor your female servant, nor your animals, nor any foreigner residing in your towns. Exodus 20, 8 through 10. We know that's one of the 10 commandments given to Moses. When we look at the word abod, to serve, we look at Genesis chapter 27, verse 29. It says, may peoples abod you. May they serve you. And nations bow down to you. Be master of your brothers, and may your mother's sons bow down to you. Cursed be those who curse you, and blessed be those who bless you. Another version of abod means to worship. Exodus chapter 3, verse 12, and God said, I will be with you, and this will be the sign to you that it is I who have sent you, that you have brought the people out of Egypt, and you will abode God on this mountain. And that's God talking to Moses. And then whenever we get later on into the priestly service, the Hebrew word is changed just a little bit to abodah, A-B-O-D-A-H. That's how we would spell it. It's talking about the priestly service, and it says in Numbers chapter 18, verse 7, but you and your sons with you shall attend to your priesthood for everything concerning the altar and inside the veil, and you are to do your abodah, your priestly service, your priestly work. Talking about the tribe of Levi. And then First Chronicles chapter 24, verse 3, with the help of, is so much easier to read it back here. With the help of Zadok, a descendant of Eleazar, and Ahimelech, the descendant of Ithamar, David separated them in divisions for their appointed order of abodah, of their royal priestly service. I know I kind of threw a bunch of verses and some Hebrew words at you real fast right there, but I want you to see the connection between what God is commanding Adam and Eve to do in the garden, to work it, to serve the garden, and what we see later on with the priests. What we see later on with the nation of Israel. You see, the same words are used to reference a priestly service of worship. And these verbs are used together as a phrase only elsewhere in the descriptions of priests and the Levites working in and around the temple. I did not put these verses up here, but if you want to jot them down, if you look at Numbers chapter 3, verse 5 through 9, it discusses that. Numbers 8 and verse 26, and then Numbers 18, verse 7, as I have up there. The only times that word is used is describing the priests. So let's look at the Garden of Eden a little bit more. Look at some imagery that we see within it. I want us to look at the Garden of Eden and then also think about the tabernacle and the temple. In the geography of Eden, if we think of creation, within the dry land of Genesis chapter 1 chapter 1 through chapter 3, it depicts kind of a three-part topography. Genesis chapter 1, verse 9 through 13, it talks about how the dry land from the sea. And then within the dry land, then you see the land of Eden. Genesis chapter 2, verse 8. And then in the same verse, it says, that in Eden, there was a garden in Eden. So now we're narrowing it down even more. And then in the next verse, in chapter 2, verse 9, we say where God planted in the center of the garden the tree of life. So again, the land, Eden, garden, the middle, the tree of life. Think of the tabernacle. Think of the temple. It was similar to Eden, wasn't it? In the tabernacle or the temple, you had, here's the land, here's the promised land, here's the tribes. And then as you go into the tabernacle or the temple, here's the courtyard. And then you have the holy place. Here's where the priests are. And then the main focus, the Holy of Holies, the holiest place. It amazes me, and we'll see this through a few other examples, that the tabernacle that the priests were to serve in, or the temple that the priests were to serve in, goes all the way back to the same imagery as given in Genesis chapter 1 and 2 of Eden. Here's the big, and we narrow it down to the very center, the tree of life. And we know the tree of life is the one that God allows. Originally, Adam and Eve could sit there and eat from the tree of life and live forever until they sinned. But that's also the tree of life that we seek after. That tree of life where we'll have that eternal life with God. And in the center of the garden is that tree of life, just as the center of that tabernacle, the temple, the holiest of holies. So thinking more of kind of the story of Eden, think of that story of the rebellion prior to it, what life was like versus after. We see that after the humans after Adam and Eve, after they rebelled, we see the good gifts of the garden were kind of inverted. They were the opposite in the world outside of God's temple, outside of God's presence in that garden. Prior to the sin, God created humans and placed Adam and Eve in the garden. And then after the rebellion, God kicks them out. They no longer can be in that garden. And then God caused, prior to it, God caused the tree of life and the tree of knowledge of good and evil to be, grew in the middle. And then after the rebellion, they're cut off. Adam and Eve are cut off from the tree of life. And before the garden, there was no human to work the ground, but yet outside it, now we're told that they were to, Adam and Eve, says cursed. You're going to have to work the ground. Humans were made mortal. And obeying God, they could remain in the garden and receive the gift of eternal life. They had access to the tree of life. But yet, whenever they sinned, they got cut off. And now they get to experience death. And because of that, you and I get to experience death. Physical death. Thankfully, we have eternal life. But we see where after the rebellion, after their sin, Adam and Eve were cut off and sent outside the garden where they no longer had access to the tree of life. And then, they were directed while they were in the garden to keep it, to serve, to keep the garden. And now, after it, we know that they are guarded from the garden. They couldn't come back in. The story tells us that there was a cherubim and the flaming sword, that no matter where Adam and Eve went, no matter how they wanted to get back into the garden, they couldn't. And the cherubim was depicted later on with the tabernacle, with the Ark of the Covenant. There's cherubim on the top of the Ark of the Covenant where the priests were to go, where the high priest was to go, and that the priests of the tribe of Levi, as they were carrying the Ark throughout, as they were conquering the land of Canaan. Well, we see that, and then we see it in the tapestries of the temple, in King Solomon, in his rule. There's cherubim all throughout, depicting the presence of God, and the place where God is, and guarding those places. Ultimately, the story of Eden and humanity makes clear that humanity's deep need for a royal priest who was to come to restore the blessings of that original Garden of Eden. The blessings where we would have life with God and have that life eternal in His creation, in His presence. So even from the very beginning, we see where a priesthood is going to be established. And it's that theme of a royal priest that we see throughout the Old Testament, and then ultimately coming into Christ. Even from the very beginning, a priesthood was being pointed at from the start. Think of Genesis chapter 14. Story of Abraham and Melchizedek. Mentioned at the beginning, Melchizedek was the first royal priest that was named in the book of Genesis. It was kind of implied that Adam and Eve were, similar to priests, that their roles were priest-like. But Melchizedek is called a priest king, though he's not from the line of Seth and Noah or Shem, at least not in the text. We don't know that, but in the text he's not mentioned of that. But what do we know about Melchizedek? Other than he's a priest and a king. Yep, he had a father and mother. What else do we know about him? Not much, is there? Basically, the only thing that we know is that he rules over Shalem, which later in the Hebrew Bible is identified as Jerusalem, if you look at Psalms 76, verses 1 and 2. In Psalm 76, 1 and 2, it says where God's tent is in Shalem. His dwelling is in Zion. This place is later called Jebus, when it is in the possession of the Canaanites. Joshua chapter 18, verse 28. Judges 19, verse 10 and 11. And 2 Samuel 5, verse 6 and 7. We see in the story, flip over there real fast, Abraham, if you remember, I say Abraham, it's Abram at the time. He rescues his nephew Lot as he's captured, and we see these kings that are fighting. These 5 kings versus these 4 kings, and Lot gets tied up in the middle of them. And Abram goes, he takes some of his servants, goes and rescues them. And we see where Melchizedek pronounces a blessing on Abram in the name of El Elyon. It's one of the descriptions of Yahweh. El Elyon. It means that he was saying it in the name of the Creator, the possessor of the skies and land. We see that in verse 19. Chapter 14, verse 19. And he blessed him, and Melchizedek blessed Abram and said, "Blessed be Abram by God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth, and blessed be God Most High, who has delivered your enemies into your hand." That God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth, is the Hebrew El Elyon. That version of Yahweh is the same one that links Melchizedek's God to Yahweh Elohim of Genesis chapter 1 and 2, the Creator. He is a genuine priest of God, the same God of Israel before Israel ever existed and before Yahweh was known by that name. If you look over at Exodus chapter 3, verse 12 through 15 is whenever that name is introduced. You see, this connects him back to the line of genuine worship that stems back to Seth in Genesis chapter 4, verse 26. Melchizedek's blessing on Abraham also links back to God's promise in Genesis chapter 12. What was his promise in Genesis chapter 12? Genesis chapter 12, verse 1 and 2. Now the Lord said to Abram, go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you, and I will make you a great nation. And here's the key. And I will bless you and make your name great so that you will be a blessing. Verse 3, I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse. And in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. See, in Genesis chapter 12, 1 and through 3, as we just read, whoever blesses you, I will bless. And in 2 chapters later, Melchizedek blesses Abram. You know, we can expect that Melchizedek and the city that he rules will experience God's blessing in time to come. Sometime in the future, the land that he rules is going to be blessed. God promised Abram that whoever blesses you, I'm going to bless. Whoever curses you, I'm going to curse. And we see where Melchizedek, the ruler of Shalem, the king, blesses, and a priest, blesses Abram. And notice how Melchizedek's blessing kind of helps develop God's own blessing on Abram. God has promised seed and land, and now Melchizedek adds deliverance from enemies to that blessing. Verse 20, back in chapter 14, blessed be God Most High, who has delivered your enemies into your hand. See, Melchizedek takes that blessing of chapter 12, 1 through 3, and adds more to it, saying that there will be deliverance from your enemies to that blessing. You see, God will bless Abram and Abraham later on with abundant descendants and a promised land. And he's going to deliver the descendants from their enemies. Thinking of Abraham, look over at chapter 22. We're starting to run out of time. I'll speed up the pace here. Abraham, chapter 22. Think of the sacrifice of Isaac. God says in the first verse of chapter 22 that he is going to test Abraham. Test him by saying, you need to sacrifice your son. Your beloved son, your only son, I demand you to sacrifice. Why do you think God was testing Abraham at that time? What had happened prior to this? Did Abraham and Sarah kind of take things into their own measure? God said, "Hey, I'm going to give you descendants." But they're old, they're barren. So then Sarah says, take my servant. She has a son, and then we see where that just kind of spirals out of control. Where Sarah now despises her servant because she did exactly what Sarah told her to do. Now she hates her because of jealousy. And then later on we see where that, by that lack of trust in God's promise, finally, Sarah gets pregnant and has Isaac. But we see with that sacrifice that he is testing him. And on that mountain where he's tested, as he's about to sacrifice his son, God tells him to stop. And then Abraham looks around and finds the ram caught over in the thistle, and they sacrifice the ram instead and say that God will provide. And just as a quick footnote, in that verse 14 of chapter 22, the mountain of Yahweh was used to describe this mountain where, that Abraham called this mountain is the mountain of Yahweh. It is only used elsewhere in the Hebrew Bible to refer to Mount Zion, the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, in Isaiah chapter 2, verse 4, Isaiah 30:29, Micah 4, and Psalm 24, verse 3. You see, this mountain where he's at, where Abraham was at, where he's sacrificing his son, only appears in the same spots that refer only to Mount Zion. See where like Abraham is kind of acting kind of like a priest, isn't he? Before the priests are even set up. He's about to offer that sacrifice to God as he is commanded to. But thankfully, God had a different plan that Abraham passed that test. And we see where Abraham is acting like that priest. He's offering that sacrifice to God. We won't have time to get into another one, but next Sunday we're going to quickly look at Moses and Aaron, and then we're going to try to culminate this by looking at Christ and us. I know there towards the end, to start running out of time, I've got to do a little bit better time on the 43 minutes to make sure I get enough put in there without rushing through some things. But brush up on Exodus chapter 4 and Exodus 24 for next week. We'll look at those two chapters mainly on Moses and Aaron before we start looking at Christ.